War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 109, a 2-year update, and why 1996 has to be understood in order to figure out what's happening with Iran today. So, to start off, this is the start of the 3rd year of this podcast. And I have to say, we're kind of flat. Overall listenership has not changed over the past year, but it hasn't gone down either. So I guess that's somewhat of a win. My thanks to the 200 or so listeners who pretty much tune in on a fairly regular basis to listen to what I have to say on general events. I know some of you fall off for a bit, then binge for a while, and then come back. On this 2nd year, I tried some different things and explored some subjects that I didn't have quite the familiarity that I had. I used a lot of scripted work. I used some AI. These are not well received. So I'm trying to do a mix of more of the free-flowing discussion, like you're hearing right now, along with some historical context, maybe a deeper dive on things that I know somewhat well. I want to revisit Clausewitz. I had one episode 3 was all about Clausewitz, but that's not enough. And as I think he is probably the best theorist on war, I need to get back into it. So we're going to get a little bit more into the theory of Clausewitz and going beyond Book 1, Chapter 1. The first year I talked about everything I really wanted to in the first season. And then I continued on the second and had to feel my way through talking about historical battles. Some of those are pretty boring, I'm not going to lie. But just knowing the 15 decisive battles and being aware of them and how that book by Creasy kind of set the tone for studying war for almost 2 centuries. So I'm going to continue with a mix of some script and some free-flowing. You'll probably not see any purely scripted episodes going forward unless I have to, which that may happen. So there'll be a little more analysis, a little more free thought, and we'll keep doing history, we'll keep doing doctrine, and I will do a better job in integrating current events to historical events. And that brings us to today. So what does 1996 have to do with what is happening with Iran today? So in 1996, there was a series of events with Iran vis-a-vis the United States that provided a model for the Iranian government. And I think the lessons might have been learned. 30 years ago is ancient history for Americans. 30 years ago is nothing for most civilizations and cultures. So going back to 1996, as we kicked off, one of the first things that happened in 1996 is the United States paid $131 million in restitution to the victims of Iran Air Flight 655, which was shot down by the USS Vincennes in 1986. This had been an ongoing litigation. And in February of 1996, we freed up the aforementioned $131 million worth of funds that ostensibly would be given only to the victims' families. None of it would go to the Iranian government. How true that is questionable, but that was the fig leaf. But then, on 25 June, Iranian proxies, Hezbollah in Saudi Arabia, attacked what's known as the Khobar Towers, which were serving as barracks for United States soldiers, primarily airmen. And 19 airmen were killed and almost 500 were wounded in that bombing. And then the next month, 17 July 1996, TWA 800 crashed. Now, I have shared my opinion, shared by others, by the way. I will add, I'm not alone in this, that TWA 800 was indeed shot down, but it wasn't by an errant United States missile. It was a deliberate attack by Iran. Those theories were floated initially at the time, although quickly quashed. So a month after that shoot down, and it can't be ignored that 2 months after Khobar Towers, the Iranian and Libya Sanctions Act was passed. Now, there had already been sanctions against Iran independently, But what the new Sanctions Act passed in August of 1996 did is it sanctioned foreign companies that did business with Iran. And after the fall of Gaddafi, Libya was removed from the sanctions list because, Libya is just such a great beacon of Western civilization right now. And it simply became the Iran Sanctions Act and still exists. We still have sanctions against companies that do business with Iran, which is kind of weird because China is their number one trading partner by far at this moment. But I'm unaware of any Chinese companies or government entities which are sanctioned in accordance with American law. A little bit of a digression. Was the Clinton administration in 1996 aware of the Iranian possible connection to TWA 800? Did that drive the timing of the passage of this act? Now, it has to be said the act had been implemented before Khobar Towers. It had been introduced and being debated through committee and whatnot through the legislative process even before Khobar Towers. But was that an impetus to get it signed? Who knows? Khobar Towers would have been enough, unquestionably. So why 1996? Well, one of the unquestioned factors that our foreign adversaries deal with is how much elections, domestic elections in the United States, drive American foreign policy strength and weaknesses. During election years, and certainly during presidential election years, and certainly when a first-term president is trying to get a second term, they are limited in how much leeway they have in foreign policy to take aggressive or provocative action. And in 1996, for those of you who remember, Bill Clinton was not doing well. He'd been rocked by various scandals. The economy was mixed. And there was some question what was going to happen with Bill Clinton in 1996. And I think the attempt to release the $131 million in that year was Bill Clinton trying to shape the political environment to alleviate pressure with Iran and to remove that from them. Iran read it in a different way. They'd gotten some of what they wanted, so let's go ahead and continue. So what purpose does attacking American assets serve the Iranian government? Are these attacks, generally speaking, an attack is a tactical thing. I mean, the etymology betrays it. However, for Iran, attacking the United States, each of these individual attacks are a political communications. They don't actually care about the effect of the attack. They don't care how many airmen they kill. They don't care how many civilians they kill, assuming they did TWA 800. The point of the attack is to attack the United States, to demonstrate that they are fighting the great Satan. And so when the United States acquiesces to Iranian demands, in the case of the release of the funds for the victims of the Iran air shootdown, for Iran, it's, well, we won there, so let's continue winning. And simply attacking and killing Americans is a strategic win for Iran in its communications message to the greater Muslim world, the Ummah, in demonstrating that they are fighting the great Satan. So they attack for attacking's sake. There is no underlying operational or tactical purpose. They're not shaping the environment in a tactical sense or an operational sense or even really in a strategic sense. They're shaping it in a grand strategy and a political sense in demonstrating their resolve to attack American targets wherever they can. And then going back to this, there was the Iranian hostages, of course, in 1979, but then there was a series of kidnappings by Iranian proxies that happened during the 1980s. These hostages, famously, you had William Buckley, not Bill Buckley. He was the CIA sanctions chief who was kidnapped in 1984 and then was murdered in captivity. A Islamic Jihad, an Iranian proxy group, took responsibility. Benjamin Weir, a missionary, Peter Kilburn, a librarian, Lawrence Jenko, a Catholic priest, Terry Anderson was a famous hostage. Journalist David Jacobson, who just ran a hospital. Thomas Sutherland was the university dean. Frank Reed was a teacher. Joseph Scipio was a university administrator. Edward Tracy was simply a journalist. And then William Higgins, Colonel Higgins, was famously assigned to the UN force observing the UN force, which was guarding the border between Israel and Lebanon. He was tortured and murdered while in captivity. these were a continuation of attacking Americans wherever they were. In this case, Americans were in Lebanon. Now, many of these were released in a spate in 1990 and 1991. Well over about 2/3 of all the hostages who were ultimately released were released during this period, well after they were kidnapped. The kidnappings generally took place in the 80s when Americans had not yet figured out that they had to get out entirely from Lebanon, country which they had operated in for decades since World War II. So why was this date important? Why 1990, 1991? Well, the critical thing to remember was that the Soviet Union dissolved. Soviet Union was the primary sponsor of Iran during this period. And when the Soviet Union dissolved, their support for Iran largely dried up. They were just incapable of supporting anyone. They could barely support themselves. This was under the Yeltsin administration in Russia. And Iran was without sponsor. China had not yet broken through as an economic powerhouse. And the leadership, with the Ayatollah, the original Ayatollah from 1979, having died, Iran needed friends. They didn't have any. So this was a period of reconciliation. But after 1990 and 1991, the moderates within the regime were quickly ousted by 1992 and 1993. Much more hard line, and the IRGC was in power by the time of the mid-90s, by the time Bill Clinton came. And you have to remember, 1990, 1991, American resolve with Desert Storm was a pretty frightening reminder of what American power could do in the Middle East if we were so motivated to do it. And there was no Soviet Union to counter it. The quick destruction of Saddam Hussein's military during Desert Storm demonstrated that Iran was very, very weak and incapable of countering American power. So I think there was a real concern there. But by the time the mid-90s came around, I think the Soviet Union gotten a little bit stronger, but more to the point, China, who began their outreach to the American markets in 1993, quickly became the leading sponsor for Iran. They had always worked with them even since the 1970s. China was a large sponsor of the Iranian government during the Iran-Iraq War, although they did it for cold hard cash. It wasn't generosity. It was Iran had oil and China had weapons, so it was a very convenient relationship. But still, even Iran and Iraq were both somewhat fighting for the same Soviet Union largesse as far as military armaments. So the point of all of this is to understand that Iran's purpose of being antagonistic to the United States does not serve mere strategic, operational, and tactical gains. It is part of their political messaging as those who simply fight the Americans because America exists. And whether they use Hezbollah, or whether they use the Houthis, or whether they use Hamas, or whether they use Islamic Jihad, or they use the various Hezbollah offshoots in different Arab countries, not just in Lebanon, it's all part of a greater Iranian message. And while Iran can deny there is any connection between them and their proxies, within the Muslim world, no one recognizes any disconnect between the two. So it's kind of a disingenuous, don't look at what they say in English, look at what they say in Farsi and Arabic, which is what really matters. So going back to all of this, the United States, as noted, paid $132 million to victims in 1996 in February. But U.S. judgments against the Iranian government for all the various attacks against Americans is $53 billion, of which the Iranians have never paid a dime. Now, there was $2 billion of that $53 billion, which was paid out from seized Iranian assets, but it certainly wasn't a voluntary action like the payment from the U.S. government to the victims of Iran air shootdown. So that's kind of a different creature. And so when Iran talks about the freeing up of seized assets, they still owe $51 billion of international judgments against the victims of their terrorism, American victims specifically. The tie between the TWA 800, Iran, the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act of 1996, we have to, as long as we're talking about Libya, we got to go back to Libya and Pan Am 103 and El Dorado Canyon. A quick reminder, El Dorado Canyon, 1986, was an attack by the United States against Libyan targets, both political and military. And then 2 years later, the Libyans retaliated with shooting down, or blowing up, I should say, using a bomb in a suitcase of Pan Am 103 in 1988. And Libya did not deny their connection really particularly well. The one person who was captured and then jailed was released for health reasons. Turns out he's still alive and still very healthy. And he got a hero's welcome when he came back to Libya. He was released by Scottish authorities who had no problem releasing someone who almost entirely killed Americans. So, yes, Libya did Pan Am 103 as retaliation for 1986, and the United States did nothing about it. So the model of if you kill enough Americans, it's so embarrassing that they won't do anything. It cannot be missed that Pan Am 103 happened in 1988, an election year, a presidential election year. It cannot be missed that TWA 800 happened in 1996, an election year. So here we find ourselves in election year now. What does all this history have to do with the current events? Any compromise with the IRGC will not be seen as a strengthening of relationships between the United States and Iran. It'll be seen as a sign of weakness on the part of the United States, and that's how it'll be taken. And while it is not a presidential election year, it is obviously a congressional election year every 2 years. The Republicans are not in good shape politically. Iran definitely sees this as leverage. Iran is completely motivated to drag this out as a means to hurt Republicans' chances because they think that a Democrat Congress will be far more willing to compromise when it comes to Iran than the current Republican Congress. It's an absolutely accurate depiction. There was recently a vote against the continuation of the what's going on with Iran. The administration denies it's any sort of war, but when there's bombings and killings going on, it's hard not to see it that way. And all Democrats and 4 Republicans voted against the current president actions against Iran and the Straits of Hormuz. So unquestionably, a Democrat-controlled Congress will be of great benefit to Iran. And Iran will do everything they can to shape the political environment in the United States, both informational and otherwise, to try to get the Democrats power in at least the House. And if they can get the House and the Senate, that's even better. Then they know for the next 2 years, Donald Trump will be doing nothing except being impeached countless times for Lord knows whatever will happen. The Democrats have already said that's what they're going to do. So that'll hamper Donald Trump's ability to enact American foreign policy against Iran. And so that's what they're playing for. And any amount of compromise on the part of Trump, thinking that it'll alleviate what's going on with Iran, actually what it'll do is exasperate it. Iran will take what they can get, obviously who wouldn't, but they're not going to become our friends. It's impossible. It's just not who they are. And this goes back to their grand strategy of being the lead of the Muslim resistance against the great Satan, which is the United States. So this goes back to what's happening with Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah will attack Israel. Israel will then retaliate against Hezbollah. And Iran will state that, well, we don't control Hezbollah, so whatever they do is not our fault. However, if Israel attacks Hezbollah, well, that's a violation of the peace treaty, and I'm not going to of the ceasefire, and I'm not going to talk to the United States as long as Israel is attacking Lebanon. So Hezbollah can attack Lebanon. Iran takes no responsibility. Israel attacks Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that's the United States' fault. This is the game Iran's playing, and it's a silly game, but the media and President Trump's political enemies are certainly more than willing to play that up. It's unfortunate, and I think it shows on some part, profound ignorance of the realities on the ground, but also part of it, just the raw politics involved and willing to use foreign policy and, frankly, the deaths of Americans and Iranians for that matter, as simply political bargaining chips to gain power in Washington, D.C. I'm not saying one party's more guilty than the other, but as a former soldier with more than one family member currently serving, it does kind of tweak me a little bit, but that's the reality of the world we live in. So all of this to simply state, Iran does not want this to end. Iran wants this to continue on and on and on. They want to hang this as a millstone or an albatross, whatever way you want to phrase it. I think albatross might be a better way to describe it. You shouldn't have shot it down in the first place, but now it's hanging around your neck. Iran will find any excuse to violate the ceasefire. Iran will find any excuse to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. They are more than willing to accept the economic damage that is being done to their economy. And it is great if it gets them in Washington, D.C., Democrats getting control, which would be beneficial to the Iranian government. I think it's kind of unquestioned, if not beneficial, at least less detrimental than the current arrangement in Washington, D.C. And a Democrat-controlled Congress will certainly be far more antagonistic to Israel and Netanyahu than the current Republican leadership. So Iran is playing a duplicitous game. They have no intent on actually coming to any sort of accord. And Donald Trump has backed himself into a corner. Iran's not going to give up their nuclear program. I already said that. I've said that a number of times. And they refuse to even accept that it's on the table. Donald Trump's great mistake in all of this, and I don't criticize him going after Iran's nuclear program because it is in American interest. I mean, even in 1996, Bill Clinton stated openly when he signed the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act that this was a direct result of Iran's attempt to get a nuclear program. So, I mean, this goes back 30 years where we know this is what they want. This is part of the justification for those sanctions. Had Donald Trump not aimed for a ceasefire and some sort of peace treaty in June of last year during the initial bombing, the 12-day war, that wasn't, and there's a podcast on that. I recommend that you go back and listen to it. If they had just continued the pressure on the IRGC without the 8-month interruption that restarted again this year, that would have given Donald Trump far more time before the midterms to work. But he, in good faith, really thought he could work something out. And this goes back to his great weakness. He just does not understand war. And going back to our episode 1, what is war? Well, it's a struggle between sovereign powers over mutually exclusive objectives. It is zero-sum game. And Donald Trump, as a businessman, does not really comprehend zero-sum games. His instinct is there's got to be a way to benefit everyone involved. And when he's dealing with a partner who just sees there is no win-win, someone must win and someone must lose, it throws off who he is. So his attempt to find a win-win solution back in June by forcing a ceasefire, all it did was take away 8 months of maneuvering room before the midterms and has limited his ability to deal with Iran in a way that matches what I think is the reality on the ground. We have the ceasefire in Gaza. Has that helped in any regard? Has that helped in Iran? Has that helped in Lebanon? No, all it has done is strengthened Hamas. And, and on that, Trump is lashing out at Netanyahu, apparently, that his actions in Lebanon are hurting his negotiations in Iran. And it may appear that way, but it's just an excuse the Iranians use. If it wasn't Lebanon, if it wasn't Hezbollah, they would find something else. And then to the point is, how many attacks against the United States, comparatively, would Donald Trump accept before he did something about it? The fact of the matter is Hezbollah continues to attack northern Israel, not military targets, just villages, whatever they can find. And 500,000 Israeli refugees have had to flee the villages in the north, which is far more populated than the Negev Desert in the south, because of these continuing attacks by Hezbollah. So Hezbollah gets to attack Israel. Israel can do nothing. Hamas remains in power. This is hurting Netanyahu politically because he's seen as an impotent junior partner with the United States, which is ironic because much of the talking point is Donald Trump works for Netanyahu, which is ridiculous on the face of it, but all sorts of things are ridiculous once you dig into them a little bit. So you wanted rambling, you got rambling. Next week, I really hope to delve back into some more finer details of Clausewitz and some of his more nuanced takes on warfare. So I'll talk to you later.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.